And thank you so much, Iris. My old roommate, in fact, he and his group have sung here before. His name is Jay. After college, Jay took a job working for this company that did car loans. In fact, in particular, high-interest car loans. And Jay worked on the collection side, where it was his job when he first started working for them to contact people who were at least or in excess of 90 days behind on their car payments to see if he could collect that debt or get them to start paying or threaten them with taking the car in hopes that they might start making payments towards these loans. And we were talking one day after he'd been doing this for a while, and he was describing some of the stories that people would describe in terms of the excuses they gave as to why they couldn't make their car payments. And I asked him, I said, what was the best excuse that you heard? And he said, well, one day I called this lady. She was over 90 days behind on her car payment. She answered the phone. I told her who I was with, explained to her that she was delinquent on her car payment, and asked why it was that she hadn't been paying. And he said, without hesitation, she began to tell this story of how she had lost her home and she went back to live with her father. Her father had this German Shepherd, and one night she went to bed and she took her teeth out, put them in a denture cup in the bathroom. Well, sometime during the night, the German Shepherd goes into the bathroom, knocks the denture cup over, and proceeds to gnaw her dentures into 1,000 little pieces. Well, she gets up the next morning and she finds the crumbs of her teeth lying in the bathroom floor. She's got no teeth to put into her head, and just for sheer embarrassment's sake, she just wasn't going to go to work, with no teeth in. And so she decided, I'm just not going to go. Well, she didn't show up for work. She lost her job. She lost her job. She couldn't make her car payment. So long story short, she couldn't make her car payment because her dad's dog ate her teeth. And I asked Jay, I said, what were you saying when she was going through and describing this story? He said, I had to put her on mute so I could laugh. I said, well, did you believe this? He said, absolutely, I believed it. He said, I've heard a lot of stories. He said, but you just can't make something like that up on the cuff. Something like that just had to be true. When we think about Jesus' entrance into the world and all the different details that are comprised and make up a part of the Christmas story, there are all sorts of responses that people have to it. And I'm sure some around the world would say, you know what, I guess it's true. There's so many unusual things about it. If we were to write what it would be like when God would take on flesh and come into the world, we would write it so differently. So it's so unusual, it must be true. And there are others who would say, well, it's a nice, pleasant story. It makes for good carols around the end of the year. Gives people nice, warm fuzzies in their mind and their heart. So, whether it's true or not, that's of little concern. It just makes for, again, just kind of nice, warm fuzzies. Jesus came into the world, big deal. Well, then there are still others that say, yes, Jesus came into the world, and hopefully you're part of this group that say, yeah, Jesus came into the world, and he did so for a reason, that he might live a life and ultimately take that life and lay it down to pay the price and the penalty for our sins. But all of these different reactions, and there are other reactions to the coming of Jesus into the world, but you could take all of them and essentially put them into one of two categories. There's the response, which is foolish, or the response of the fool, and the response which is wise, or the response of those who are wise. Well, what characterizes essentially these two responses? We see the answer to that question today in the second chapter of Matthew. If you would look with me in your Bibles today to Matthew chapter 2, starting with verse 1. Matthew chapter 2, starting with verse 1. So many times, especially as part of our Christmas productions and Christmas cards, we include the wise men as a part of what took place on that first Christmas night. But the truth is, it was probably much later, perhaps as much as 2 years after the birth of Jesus, that what we read here with regard to the wise men actually occurs. But Matthew describes it starting in verse 1 of chapter 2 as saying, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented to him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. In this passage, you really have, as I said, two different categories of response to the coming of Jesus. There's the response of the fool, there's the response of the wise. And based on what Matthew records for us here, the first thing we see to describe those responses is this. Fools view the coming of Jesus as a threat. Fools view the coming of Jesus as a threat. In this story, there's essentially three groups of characters. There's the wise men, there's Herod and the people of the city of Jerusalem, and then there are the religious leaders. You have probably heard and read over the years this passage and this story perhaps dozens and dozens, and maybe even over 100 times before. But there's a little something in this passage that's easy to miss. Perhaps over all these years you have missed this, and it's in verse 3 where we are told, "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." The question is, why was Herod so troubled about the birth of Jesus? Beyond that, why were the people in the city of Jerusalem likewise also troubled by the coming of Jesus? Well, to answer that question, you got to kind of go back and set the stage as to what's going on. We have these wise men, or magi. The term magi gives us in English our word magic or magician. We don't know how many wise men there were. So many times we describe them as three wise men. We sing, "We three kings of Orient are." But the truth is, the text doesn't tell us how many there were. We suppose perhaps there were three because there were three gifts that they brought. There could have been 4, 5, 6. All we know is that there were more than one. We don't know exactly beyond that where they were from, apart from the fact that they were from the east. Many speculate somewhere in Persia is where these individuals were from. But these magi, these wise men, were a group of people that had been around for multiplied centuries. And they were some of them very much associated with occultic practices, but these were very much among the most educated, most erudite, most well-trained and well-learned of anybody in culture. They were steeped in their understanding of agriculture, of science, of history, and of varied religious traditions. They were also understood as being a group of people that was especially gifted with the interpretation of dreams. Many Old Testament scholars believe that Daniel was brought in to be part of this group. The Old Testament prophet Daniel was part of this group we know as the wise men or the magi. Now, we don't know exactly how it is that God communicated this to them, but God has somehow communicated to these individuals, wherever they were, how many of them there were, that the Messiah, that the promised one that the Jews had been looking for more than a millennia, that this child has been born. And they are also instructed by God that He is going to provide to them miraculous guidance in the form of what the text describes as a star, some type of light that would guide them and go before them so that they would know the direction and it would ultimately lead them to this one that has been born. And so they have been following this star for who knows how long, perhaps months on end, as they're making their way to try to find the one who has been born. And when they get to Jerusalem, it seems that this star, this light that has gone on before them, it seems that it disappears for a period of time. They can't see it. And so they go into Jerusalem, and you've got to think that it was obviously more than one individual. There was a group of them, probably traveling in a caravan of people with assistants and aides and just an entourage going with them, servants and the like. And so they come into Jerusalem, and they attract a great deal of attention. People notice them and they say, "Hey, these are those magi that we've heard about." And so people are paying attention. They're wondering, what are these people doing in the city of Jerusalem? And so the Magi are going, and they go into the city, and they have a question. And their question is very simple. Where is Jesus? And the question that they ask in verse 2 is, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? In all likelihood, they have begun to ask people in the city, hey, where is this newborn King of the Jews? Where is he at? They just assumed that everybody knew the answer to that. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Well, we've kind of got a king. His name's Herod. Why don't you go ask him? And so they make their way to Herod, and they ask Herod himself the question, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Now, for this to make more sense, you need to know a little bit about Herod. Herod was a bad dude. He was a really bad guy. And he is in the position of essentially the governor of the area that we would know as modern-day Israel or Palestine. And as this area is still under the thumb or under the control of the Roman Empire. Well, he had been named as the Roman governor. We know him later as Herod the Great. And the Parthians, years before this, had rose up against the Romans and expelled them. And so Herod has to go back with his hat in his hand back to the emperor, and he has to try to explain how they were expelled, how they were defeated. He gets back in good graces with the emperor, and the emperor sends Herod back with Roman armies to retake the area that we know as Israel. Herod and his armies are successful, and consequently, the Roman emperor gives to Herod the title King of the Jews. Now, again, Herod is an awfully bad dude. He's very suspicious. He is very untrusting of people and deeply concerned with his own well-being and his own maintenance of power, position, and prestige. And so because of this, he again was very suspicious of people. He married a woman whose name was Miriam. Her brother was, at that point, the high priest. And when he began to feel threatened by his brother-in-law, he has his brother-in-law drowned. His wife doesn't know, and Herod shows up at the funeral, and he is weeping and wailing, oh, he's gone. But the truth is, he was behind this. Later, he had both his wife and his mother-in-law executed. Beyond that, Herod had 2 of his 3 sons killed, and 5 days before his own death, he had his 3rd son killed. This was a bad dude. To make matters worse, Herod knew that the Jews did not like him, and when word got out of his death, that people would be celebrating, thank goodness he's gone. And so in advance of his own death, when he began to sense that his time was limited, just days before his death, he had the religious and social leadership of Jerusalem arrested. He left word and instructions that when he died, all of these people were to be executed so that in Jerusalem, at his death, people would be weeping. This is a terrible, awful man. And these wise men, these magi, they come to Herod and they say, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Well, Herod hears that and he recoils. He's troubled by this because what is Herod thinking? I'm the King of the Jews. Caesar himself gave me this title. And so he is deeply concerned and deeply distressed, and he wants to find out where this Jesus is, where this new King of the Jews is, because he wants to be done with him. Why? Because Herod was a fool, and a fool views the coming of Jesus as a threat. Herod viewed the birth of Jesus and his entrance into the world as a threat to his own power and to his own control. This past summer, Nathan, as the summer began, had his first loose tooth. Nathan, at his first birthday, he didn't have any teeth. They started showing up late, so it was late for him when they started getting loose. And so when the summer began, he had a bottom tooth that he would show me, and he could wiggle it a little bit, and he would try to work on it to see if he could get this tooth out, but it just wasn't loose enough. And I would tell him, Nathan, it just needs to wait a little bit longer. I promise you, it's going to get looser and you can get it out. Well, finally, in August, we had gone to the beach with Caroline's family for a week of vacation. And while we were there, Nathan's tooth has gotten really loose. In fact, one night he comes up to me and he says, hey, Daddy, look how loose my tooth is. And he wiggles it, and it almost lays flat. I mean, it was just gross how far this tooth lays back. And I said, Nathan, that tooth is loose enough. You can get that bad boy out. And so he begins to work on it, and he just can't get it. He comes to me and he said, Daddy, my tooth won't come out. And I said, well, Nathan, if you'd like, I'll be glad to pull it for you, because, these gentle hands. And so Nathan says, no, I don't want you to do that. That'll hurt. And I said, Nathan, I promise, it won't hurt. This tooth is so loose, I can just get that thing out so quickly. And Nathan, he won't give me permission to do this. And he says, no, I don't want you to do it. He continues to mess with it, but he just cannot get this tooth out. And so finally, it's bedtime. Nathan goes to bed. And after he had been in his room for a few minutes, I heard him crying. And so I went in there and I said, Nathan, what's the matter? And he said, Daddy, my tooth hurts. And I said, Nathan, the only way that tooth is going to get better is if it comes out. That's the only way the pain is going to stop. If you'll let me just one time grab that thing, I promise you I will get it out. Again, at first he's reluctant. He doesn't want to give me that opportunity. He doesn't want to give me that control. But finally, it's so uncomfortable that he relents and he says, okay, I'll let you try just one time. And so we get up, we go to the bathroom. I get a piece of Kleenex. And so I grabbed that tooth and I said, all right, on 3. And I counted 1, 2, 3, and I yanked that bad boy right out. And all of a sudden, things felt so much better. Now, all of this turned out well for Nathan for this simple reason. He gave me control. He gave me control. This had a far different ending and had a far more successful resolution because he gave me control. So long as he was in charge, so long as he had control, things weren't going so well. It only got better when he gave me control. Now, I want you to understand that Herod completely misunderstood this idea of Jesus coming into the world and this title of him being king of the Jews because he thought, and so many others in Jerusalem thought, that Jesus came so that he might gain the seats of power of government. But Jesus didn't come to get control of government. Jesus came to get control of people. He didn't want the seats of government. He wanted the throne of people's hearts. I don't want you to misunderstand me in this. Jesus did come for control, but not of kingdoms, not of nations, but of people. And at first, people may recoil at this, but here's the simple truth. When he is in control, things go much better. When he is in control, the end result is far better. When you and I are in control, when Herod was in control, things just don't turn out well. Think back over this past year, just in the year 2012, how many times when you can recognize, hey, I was in control, I was making the decisions, I was in charge, and I did this, and that. Consequently, my finances look like this. Consequently, my relationships look like this. Consequently, my job and my work performance looks like this. How many of you are experiencing a mess because you have been in control? Listen, Jesus came into this world so that he might gain control of you, so that he might rule from the throne of your heart. He wants to be in charge. He desires to have control. And here's the good news. When he is in control, things are better. Things are markedly better. I promise you, you will have a different 2013 if you will give Jesus control of your life. If you will give him control of your relationships, if you'll give him control of who you are. A wise person will do that, but a fool will not. Why? Because they view Jesus coming as a threat to my control, a threat to my power. But listen, when you and I are in charge, the end result is going to be a mess. Jesus came to give you life and to give it to you abundantly. He came to give to you his blessings. He came to give to you eternal life. He came to give you all of these things, but it only happens when you give him control. Fools view the coming of Jesus as a threat, but fools also view the coming of Jesus with absolute indifference. Fools view the coming of Jesus with indifference. Herod has heard the news from these magi. And they say, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? Herod is, in verse 3, troubled. And after he has told these wise men, hey, you go see if you can find him and let me know so that I might worship him also. And once the wise men have left his presence, he gathers together the religious leadership. He gets in verse 4 all the chief priests, the scribes together, and he asks them, "Where is this Christ born?" And it seems without hesitation they answer him. They say in verse 5, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet." And then they quote from the prophet Micah. And they say, "Well, we'll tell you where he's been born. The prophet said he was going to be born in Bethlehem. That's where he is at." Now, keep in mind who's talking here. These are people steeped in religious tradition. These are the religious elite of the Jews. These are the chief priests. These are the scribes. These are the people that spend their days copying the Word of God. They knew this better than anybody else. They knew all the promises and they knew all the prophecies that had been given by God throughout the Old Testament. They knew about this one that was to come, and they knew exactly where he was to be born. They knew that he was to be born of a virgin. They knew that he was going to be born in Bethlehem. And when the news comes from the Magi that he has been born, the king says, "Where's he at?" They say he is in Bethlehem. So far, so good. But the question is, what happens? These people that are steeped in the understanding of God's Word, steeped in religious tradition, what do? Do they leave where they are? Do they say, "Hold the presses, we got to go see him for ourselves"? No. They do absolutely nothing. Zilch. Nada. Squat. They do absolutely nothing. These people that knew better than anybody else about this one that was to come, when they hear of his coming, when they hear that he has been born, they do absolutely nothing. They responded to the coming of Jesus with absolute indifference. Not only did they not respond and did they essentially ignore him when he was born, they continued to ignore him throughout the course of his life. When they finally did show him attention, it was nothing but rejection. They would not listen to him as he taught. They ignored him as he performed miracles. They sought ultimately to have him executed, to be done with him. When he came as a fool, they just ignored him. These are the same type of people that Jeremiah described in Lamentations chapter 1, where he says, "Is it nothing to all you who pass this way?" Here are the people that knew about him. They had all of this detail, all of these promises of God, all of these prophecies. And when they hear that he's in the world, when they hear that he's been born, what do? Absolutely nothing. They responded to the coming of Jesus with absolute indifference. A number of years ago, back when I was single, my friend David, who has spoken here, he and his family now are missionaries in Africa. But Nathan was in seminary at Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, and I'd gone out to see him. And my flight got in at night. It was dark, and so I couldn't see much of the campus that night when we arrived. But we'd gone back to his dorm, whatever it was that he was living in. And I noticed that night that there was a train that passed by a couple of times. And I heard the train as it was blowing. I could tell that it was pretty close to us. The next day I was actually able to see the campus. And it's a beautiful, sprawling campus there in Fort Worth, well manicured, and just a beautiful place. But on one side of the campus at Southwestern Seminary, it backs up to these train tracks. And I began to notice that the train passed by an awful lot. In fact, I decided after hearing this thing so many times, I was going to count how many times in just 1 hour a train passed by the seminary. 6 times in 1 hour a train passed by. The ground rumbling, the horn blowing. And I said something to David that day. I said, "Does this get on your nerves? Is it aggravating how much the train passes by?" And he said, "You know what? I don't even hear it anymore." Now, this was a big deal to me. This mattered to me. I noticed this. But he was so acclimated to it. He was so accustomed to hearing it. He just didn't hear it anymore. He just ignored it. He was just indifferent to it. The religious leadership was in many ways so acclimated to the promises of God, so acclimated to what God had said. They had heard it so many times, they had copied it by hand so many times, that when the fruition of those promises actually occurred, they just didn't pay any attention to it. You know, the truth is, unfortunately, there are so many, perhaps even more than a few here today, but so many seated in churches on this very Sunday, at this very time, that are not much different in their response to the coming of Jesus than the religious leaders of that day. Yeah, he's come. Big deal. Yeah, he was born in Bethlehem. He's born of a virgin. All of these things are true. Big deal. Big deal. I want you to understand, though, yes, that's a response to the coming of Jesus, but it is a foolish response. The fool responds to the coming of Jesus with indifference. The fool responds to the coming of Jesus as it being some type of threat, but God doesn't want us to respond as a fool, but rather as one who is wise. How do wise respond? Well, the wise are affected by the coming of Jesus. The wise are affected by the coming of Jesus. So the wise men have left the presence of Herod, and they've continued their search. And thankfully for them, we're told that this star appears again. And we're told in verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. It's difficult to see it in English, but in Greek there are 3 superlatives that are given. It's as if they were the most happy, the most glad, the most joyful. I mean, they are so relieved. They are finally going to be able to find where this one that's been born King of the Jews actually is. And so the star appears again, and they begin to follow it. And we're told in verse 11, when they had come into the house, the star has guided them even to the house where Jesus is. They saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and what do? We're told that they fell down and worshiped him. They fell down and worshiped him. Obviously, the coming of Jesus into the world presents the world with a tremendous opportunity to worship the one that's come. That's obviously the desire and the plan of God, that when Jesus came into the world, that we might worship him. And here you have these wise men. They see this little baby. They've been miraculously guided to him. Once they see him, they fall down and they worship him. Beyond that, they give him gifts that are literally fit for a king. They give him the gold. They give him the frankincense. They give him the myrrh. But what is interesting to me is the limit of the wise men's knowledge. What did they know? All they knew is that they had been told somehow by God that the King of the Jews has been born, and they have been directed to him. They have followed that guidance, and they see him. And what do they do when they see him? Once they just know that much of his identity, what do? They fall down and they worship him. They present gifts to him. In short, they are affected by who he is. But again, keep in mind the limit of the wise men's knowledge. Did they know all the prophecies related to his coming? I don't think so. Beyond that, did they know what Jesus was going to do? Did they know about the miracles that he was going to perform? Did they know what was going to happen 30 years later in Cana, where Jesus would turn water into wine at this wedding? Did they know how Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead? Did they know how Jesus was going to take people who were blind and give them sight, and deaf people and give them hearing, and lame people and give them the ability to walk again? Did they know all of those things or any of those things? Absolutely not. Did they know that Jesus ultimately was going to willingly lay his life down and suffer a cruel, humiliating death on a cross? Did they know that? No, they didn't know that. Did they know how Jesus was going to be buried in a borrowed tomb, and how 3 days later that they came to anoint the body, but Jesus was not there, and an angel was to show up and say, he's not here, he is risen? Did they know any of that? No. All they had was this just absolute smidgen of truth about the identity of Jesus, and it affected them to the point where they give him these costly gifts and fall on their faces to worship him. Oh, what does that say about we who, like Paul Harvey, know the rest of the story? Understanding who he is and that he has come, the response should be that it affects us in a dramatic way because we understand his identity. We know the whole story. Obviously, you know who I am. I'm Michael Owens. You know my story. I'm from Charlotte. You know where I've gone to school. You know that I'm married and I've got, 40, 50 kids. And Beyond that, obviously, you know that I'm a pastor. Now, when I meet people, that's not always the first thing that I say to them, but it's easy in the course of conversation. We talk about what each other does, and so I describe the fact that I'm a pastor. And it's amazing how that fact affects people, because all of a sudden they start to say things like, and you can tell that they are very much on edge, concerned that they may say the wrong thing, they may do the wrong thing, or they may laugh at the wrong thing. Now, you know, I laugh at everything, and then so it's funny to see that this affects people. But anyway, so they're affected by who I am. Now, this is true even in church. It's true here at Gate City. It was true at our church in Charlotte. And that is that, for example, I may, with the senior adults, or maybe with youth, or maybe with some group, I show up at something, and they say, "Oh, better watch out what you say. Here's the preacher," or "Oh, you better be on your best behavior. There's the preacher." Well, you've known me long enough now, you don't have to do that. But at least at first, you're very much concerned. And still to this day, people will say, "Oh, you better watch out. There's the preacher," or "You better straighten up. The preacher's here with us." Now, I recognize that a lot of those are statements that are made in jest. But the truth is that there is a consequence to that fact. And the reality is that my presence, when people know who I am, when they know what I do, it does affect them. There are things that they don't say. There are things that they don't talk about. There are things that they might have otherwise been doing that they do not do. Why? Because they understand and they know of my identity. Think of what the wise men knew relative to this little baby's identity. He's going to be he's the King of the Jews. God said He was going to come, and here He is. That's all they knew. How much more do we know? We know that He came. We know about all. We not only have the rest of the story, we have the entire story. We know about all the promises, and we have it codified in the pages of the Old Testament. We know how Jesus fulfilled those prophecies to an exact T. We know about His birth that was miraculous. We know about His conception that was miraculous. We know about His life, His ministry, His death, His burial, and thankfully His resurrection. We know all of that. And so how much does it affect us? Too much of the time, not much at all. We just go about and do our regular thing day in and day out. Listen, that's not the response of the wise. That's the response of the fool. The fool is indifferent to His coming, but when you know who He is, when you get that in your mind, when you get that in your heart, man, it affects everything. If these who knew just that smidgen of information about Jesus give Him these great gifts, these costly gifts, if they fall on their faces worshiping Him, how much more should we be affected who know everything about Him, who know the rest of the story, who know His full identity, who know what He's done, not simply for the world, but He's done for us. Listen, the wise are affected, radically affected, by the coming of Jesus. Two simple responses: the response of the wise, the response of the fool to the coming of Jesus. How has His coming affected you? What would be the description of your response to the coming of Jesus? The fool or the wise? Have you been affected? Or have you responded with passive indifference? I want you to bow your heads with me.